All right, so the next talk is ransomware defense and response, minimizing risk of an increasing threat with Gabriel Currie and Will Oram. Gabriel specializes in focusing on an organization's ability to prevent, detect, and respond to targeted cyber attacks. Will is basically helping organizations to manage their response to cybersecurity breaches, work at reducing risk, and has led both offensive and defensive teams. They will be talking to us about something that is affecting people globally. It's really a shame in terms of the ransomware. My stance on ransomware has always been that ransomware affects organizations who are either not backing up their data or incapable of restoring their data from backup. And since my first job in computers in 1988, when I was 15 years old, I was literally running tape backup after school. It was kind of like, oh, I thought that we were doing that all along. So I want to thank you both very much for joining us and talking about this, because people need to understand how to get this under control. So take it away, gentlemen.
Cool. Well, look, thanks very much, Chris, and hello, SANS. Good evening from a dark and stormy London. It's great to be here. So, as Chris said, over the past year, there's been a huge increase in human-operated ransomware attacks, and those seem to be dominating the headlines these days. And so me and my PwC colleague, Will Oram, are here to talk to you about how you can prevent and respond to these attacks. This is the point where I need to work out how to move forward on the slide. And it should just click it. Great, awesome. Okay, so as mentioned, my name's Gabe Currie. There's my Twitter handle. And alongside Will, I lead PwC UK's cyber threat advisory team. And our job is to help clients to improve and implement technical controls that prevent, detect, and respond to serious cyber attacks. My background is in intelligence, incident response, and security consulting. So, in fact, Will, sorry, back to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Will Oram. As of Gabe, I lead up our cyber threat advisory team in our UK cybersecurity practice, where we help clients remediate from cybersecurity incidents. My background's in incident response and red teaming, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about ransomware. Back to you, Gabe.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. Sorry for ignoring you. Okay, so over the course of the next 18 minutes, we're going to talk to you about three things. The first of those is what human-operated ransomware is and how these attacks work in practice. Second, we're going to talk through some of the technical controls that can prevent human-operated ransomware attacks. And then third and finally, we're going to talk about how to manage and coordinate the response to human-operated ransomware attacks. So diving straight in, section 1, human-operated ransomware attacks. So like we said, human-operated ransomware is one of the biggest cyber threats that we see facing organizations today. It's different and more challenging than lots of previous ransomware strains that we've seen, things like NotPetya and WannaCry. And the key is that these attacks are human-operated. It's in the name. But what that means is that there's a skilled and adaptable human who sits behind that attack, and that's a human with a goal of making as much money as possible. This means that they're adaptable and that they change, both over time and within an individual intrusion. That attacker can overcome defenses within an organization, and Will's going to talk to you about how we see them doing that. And they can also adapt their tools, techniques, and procedures to maximize the likelihood of victims paying out. So, for example, we've seen attackers over the past year moving to using leak sites to try and pressure organizations to pay up before data is released, and just recently using things like DDoS attacks to add additional pressure onto the victim. So some of the ransomware strains that we see on the right-hand side, so things like Doppelganger, Rebuild, Maze, Riot, and names that are increasingly in the press as well. So Will, over to you.
Fantastic. So I'm sure lots of you are already familiar with how these attacks work, but just to do a quick recap before we talk about how to prevent and detect them. So in a vast majority of cases, attackers exploit internet-facing vulnerabilities or send phishing emails to organizations to gain that initial access. And most of the time, it's not ransomware attackers doing this, it's other criminal groups who specialize in doing this. And then they transfer and sell the access to the ransomware attackers when they find particularly lucrative targets and organizations to gain access to. We then see the skilled attackers arriving, and they compromise privileged accounts across organizations by exploiting IT and Active Directory hygiene issues, using very similar tools to what red teams use, like Bloodhound. We then see attackers moving laterally around organizations, going after servers with lots of data or lots of access to the network, using a mixture of security tools and legitimate administrator tools like Cobalt Strike or WMI. We then see them exfiltrating data and then eventually deploying ransomware across the network. And increasingly, we're seeing attackers here take steps to increase the effectiveness of that ransomware and cause maximum disruption to organization. So disabling security controls like AV, targeting on-prem, cloud and offline backups, and improving the performance of their malware actually encrypting files. And a really key thing to state, I think, when you look at this slide here is that this doesn't happen in minutes or hours. What we see with these attacks is quite often they take days, weeks, or months between that initial intrusion, when someone might get infected by commodity malware like Dridex or a phishing email, through to the final stage in that network intrusion where the attacker deploys ransomware. So next slide, please. So to quickly give a bit of brief background on the threat landscape, there's been a sharp increase in the number of incidents over the last 9 months, as Gabe mentioned. And there's two main reasons for why we've been seeing this. So firstly, there's been a massive growth in the number of attackers carrying out these attacks. And that's basically because attackers are following the money, and there's a lot of money here. We're even seeing established cyber criminal actors switching over to carrying out ransomware ops when maybe previously they carried out, tried to steal payment card data, for example. And according to the FBI, ransomware victims have paid out more than £140 million over the last 6.5 years to the attackers behind this. So it's profitable business. And I think that really shows that probably as long as organizations continue to pay ransoms, these attacks are only going to continue and probably increase in frequency. So definitely a growing threat that organizations need to worry about. We've also seen the use of ransomware affiliate programs that have really lowered the bar for entry for actors to get involved in these attacks. So seeing cyber criminal groups basically advertising job adverts on cybercrime websites, trying to get people involved in their affiliate schemes. And then, as Gabe mentioned, we've also seen the emergence of these leak sites that have made this far more profitable because it's made it more likely that organizations are actually going to pay the ransom. I think the complexity is both regulatory and legal, but having your sensitive data leaked onto the internet can't be overstated. Sort of how difficult that is for organizations. And by the end of September, we've seen over 750 organizations over the past 9 months have their sensitive data publicly leaked out onto the internet by ransomware attackers. So a massive threat. So next slide, please. So next, we're going to jump straight into talking about how do you actually prevent these attacks, right? This is what we're here for today, this and talking about how to respond to them. So next slide, please. So the best way to defend against these attacks is by taking actually what we've learned, so that threat intel, and then using that to inform our defense. So on the left, we've got some of the key things that I think we can draw from threat intel. And on the right, I think actually some of the key priorities that organizations should focus on to prevent these attacks. So that's reducing the attack surface, focusing on preventing the opportunistic phishing attacks that allow the attackers getting in the first place. Next, reducing attackers' dwell time. So focusing on detecting and containing these attacks before it's too late and attackers deployed a ransomware, and exploiting those days and months of time that defenders have got to try and catch these attacks before it's too late. Next, limiting the blast radius of unauthorized access. So attackers are going to get in, but there are actions you can take to make sure that, well, to make sure and to make it a lot harder for attackers to deploy ransomware widely across your network. And then lastly, prepare rapid isolation and recovery options so that if the worst happens and an attack does happen in your network, you have the options and the levers to pull to disrupt that attacker and try and get them out of your network and limit the damage that they can do. Next slide, please. So for each of these areas, we've peeled out here some of the key capabilities and controls that we think organizations need. And there's obviously a lot here, and these slides are being shared afterwards. So I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm sure you'll be relieved to know, but I'll just highlight a couple which I think are really interesting. So first up, as I spoke about that, like opportunistic phishing, how these attackers are getting in quite commonly through like Dridex, Emotech, QuickBot, being sent in these mass phishing campaigns. There's actually a lot of technical controls that organizations can put in place to reduce the risk of them getting impacted by these opportunistic attacks. And it's not just security awareness that organizations should rely on. And I've got some examples there, like restricting the execution of Microsoft Office macros, a really challenging business problem, but there are things that can be done to increase the cost of the attacker and to prevent some of the most common ways that attackers use Microsoft Office macros. And also effectively configuring email and web security tooling. So for example, stopping users being able to be emailed like .hta files as attachments. And then probably the second thing to call out in terms of key capabilities organizations need are capabilities around protecting privileged accounts, because I think the primary goal for these attackers when they get into networks is to escalate their privileges and to move up to domain admins so they can deploy that ransomware across the domain. And quite often, especially with Active Directory, organizations aren't protecting those privileged accounts. So trying to think about like, where domain admin accounts used, can we restrict where domain admin accounts are used, can we securely architect and configure Active Directory? And yeah, lots of other stuff here. Probably one other thing to call out is endpoint detection and response. Obviously, a great capability to deploy. It's going to step change your cybersecurity posture, but actually we quite often see that organizations actually haven't made the most use out of that and haven't actually put the rules in there to detect the tools and techniques that these attackers are using. So you put the rules in there to detect things like Cobalt Strike, WMI, Emotech. So definitely go and test those techniques and make sure you can defend against them. Next slide, please. So how do you actually go about and implement those improvements in your organization? Well, 3 things. So 1, understand your vulnerability to the threat. And I mean, a way to do that is to think about what techniques these attackers are using, base that all off the MITRE framework, and then actually go and test those techniques in your organization. 2, deliver tactical improvements to reduce the risk. So think about what improvements can you make tactically to prevent and detect those techniques. So if it's Kerberos roasting, is it actually going to go and set a stronger password on that service account that can be Kerberos roasted? And key to do that is collaboration between IT and security teams. And then next is delivering sustainable cyber risk reduction. So actually thinking about what are the root causes behind why those techniques could be carried out on your network. What strategic improvements can you make sure that doesn't happen again? Next slide, please. And then the last slide in this section, I think it'd just be worth touching on that actually tactical improvements can make a real difference here. And that's because we're speaking about some of the tools and techniques that these attackers use, but one of the main reasons why they're able to use those tools and techniques is because organizations have AD and IT hygiene issues. They have detection and response capabilities that aren't really truly effective at detecting the tools and techniques used by these attackers. And often they've got IT and security controls that just aren't quite effectively configured well enough to defend these attacks. So in all of those areas, there's places where organizations can make tactical improvements, and we've seen organizations in weeks and months actually implement targeted tactical improvements that can make a real difference. And when you take that technique focused approach in the previous slide, detecting and preventing the actual techniques used by these attackers, that allows you to actually increase the cost at every stage of the kill chain and really put in barriers and hurdles to the attacker and make it more complicated. That means that the opportunistic attacks aren't getting in, and even when you have those more skilled attackers in your network, you're making it harder for them at every stage and creating more opportunities to detect them, making life harder for the attacker. And that really reduces your risk and gives you a lot more of a fighting chance at more fairly defending against these attacks. So I'm going to hand over to Gabe now, who in the last sort of final section of this talk is going to talk about, if the worst comes to worst, how do you actually respond if what you have one of these attacks in your network?
Awesome, thanks very much, Will. So yeah, as mentioned, we're going to now talk about how we can manage the response to a ransomware attack. If I can get the slide to move on to that. Cool. So a ransomware outbreak is a super challenging situation for pretty much any company. It's a toxic combination of a network intrusion and a massive availability outage. And there are loads and loads of challenges that someone dealing with that ransomware outbreak is going to have to think about. And so we've got a couple of those challenges on the slide. As before, we're not going to talk through all of these, but where we want to focus on today is around managing and coordinating the response and recovery. And often, this can be one of the most complex things to do because organizations just aren't built to deal with this kind of challenge, which often involves rebuilding their entire IT environment from scratch. It's a huge task, and not one that most organizations are set up to deliver straight away. So when it comes to management and coordination, there are basically 3 questions that we always recommend thinking about in terms of security incidents. And if you can't answer these 3 questions, then you're not perhaps doing it quite right. So first of all, what's happened? Secondly, what's the plan? And third, who's in charge? So if you can answer these 3 questions, then you've got a pretty good handle of things. So in terms of what's happened, often we see that organizations just don't really have a clear understanding of the facts of the matter, right? And that's pretty understandable. The ransomware attack might have taken out things like the CMDB or the IT team's collaboration platforms or documentation storage, and the security tooling might not be available to actually work out what the current state of the environment is. The key things that we really want to work out here is what's the activity, what has the attacker actually done on the network, how they got in, how they moved across the network laterally, what impact have they had, and has there been any exfiltration of data? That's something that's really important from a regulatory perspective. Secondly, what systems have been impacted, and then what are the actual business impacts of them? So one of the things that we see clients doing in these situations is doing IT for IT. So it's really important to get the business involved really quickly and understand, okay, well, we don't have these applications anymore. What does that actually mean for the kind of continuing function of the company? Secondly, what's the plan? So often we see organizations jumping straight into crisis mode, but they won't necessarily have the kind of operational rhythm or program management that you need to deal with the response to a ransomware attack, which can last into weeks or months. And you can't keep on pulling 20-hour days for 6 months. That's just not going to work. So think about how you can put in place that strategy, how the organization actually wants to respond to the attacker activity that's been identified, how we're actually going to deliver that response, who's going to do it, and then also think about what next. So if the incident escalates, if we identify exfiltration of data, if we identify the attacker hands on keyboard again, how are we going to actually respond to that? So kind of planning ahead. And then finally, who's in charge? So like I said, organizations often just aren't structured organizationally to deal with this kind of thing. There is a lack of leadership and accountability, and there might not be the right structures in place. So think about who's going to lead that response, and both at the senior levels and also at the workstream level. Now, there are some tools that can help you to actually ensure you can answer these questions effectively. And broadly, they fit into 4 categories. First of those is teams, so making sure that you structure the response based on the organization and the incident. So thinking about who's in charge and what are the different work streams that we have under that, delivering what we need to deliver. What are the artifacts that we're going to create? Sometimes in a crisis, it can feel weird sitting down and documenting things, but like we said, a ransomware response can stretch into the months, and it's really important to start building that foundation that the rest of your response is going to rely on. Reporting, telling people the stuff that they need to know, and then meetings, the bane of everyone's life, and crisis situations can often result in meeting paralysis, just meeting after meeting after meeting. But actually, properly structured and effectively run meetings is so important to ensure that the right people know the right things at the right time. But as much as I'd like it to be, it's not all about project management. And there's a whole load of things to think about in terms of actually what are we going to do to resolve this. And generally that's executed across 4 stages. What are we going to do right now, in the short term, in the medium term, and then in the long term? So today I just want to touch on a couple of points in terms of the medium term, again with that focus on management and coordination. So first of all, something that's so important is actually what are the structures that we're going to use to coordinate decision making and to actually make stuff happen in the environment. The organization structure might not necessarily be right for that. So we've seen organizations build cross-functional teams, bringing in external help, bringing in people from all across the organization to try and deliver on specific objectives, kind of breaking out of those standard business as usual teams. Then also, who's important to me when I'm doing this response? So we've talked about engaging with the business and not doing IT for IT's sake. So making sure that actually we're identifying the people who can tell us what they need so we can deliver the right thing. And then investigation, that's so important. So, you know, what's the actual extent of the attack? What are we dealing with here? And then based on that understanding, what does that mean for the business? And then based on that, how can we as IT enact business continuity plans that we can actually keep delivering those services? And then how are we actually going to respond to this from a legal and regulatory perspective? And a ransom strategy is a big part of that. And obviously there's been some recent announcements to the US government which impact how organizations might want to think about it. But I'm not a lawyer, sorry. So I'm going to stop there and not talk about ransom strategies anymore. And with that, I'm going to close. I think if anybody does have any questions, pop back onto the Ask Us Anything session, which will be later on today. Or alternatively, get in touch with us on social media. There are our handles there. But otherwise, that's it from me and Will. Thank you so much for having us. And like I said, if you've got any questions, we'd love to hear them.